We'll introduce ourselves and then we'll kind of jump in. I'm Sarah Quinn from the Poyner Institute.
I'm Dave Stanton. I run a little studio called Smart Media Creative.
And I'm Jeremy Gilbert. I teach media product design at Medill in Midwestern.
And the three of us, along with Mario Garcia, did the most recent eye tracking studies for the Poyner Institute series. It's the 5th of our studies. And this one was specifically on tablet. And we took a look at a number of questions and we continue to kind of roll some things out. And when we say eye tracking, we kind of love the word eye tracking, but it also included some quantitative, qualitative, other elements.
Yeah,
of
other research methodologies that aren't necessarily eye tracking hardware, so to speak.
Right. So how many of you have taken a look at this study? So you have a certain. So we're gonna run briefly through what we found, and then we'd also like to talk a little bit more about what universities might do, what the industry is sort of looking for, what we're doing next, and then perhaps what classrooms might do. And at any time that you have questions, just please holler. So we took a look, and you guys, you might have to spell me here because I talk too much. But
keep on going.
Yeah, we took a look at how people chose what to read on a tablet, and then how they read once they chose. And we brought in a number of people. We ended up using 36 case studies. And we came in, they spent about 90 minutes with us. We had eye tracking gear and we asked them what they liked to read. We watched them and then we looked very, very closely at how they interacted with stories. We used very traditional eye tracking goggles, which allowed us not only to see what they were looking at any given time and created this little video that showed us where they were looking, but of course we were able to see what they tapped. We were able to see intention of things. Sometimes they would go, oh no, and so we were able to kind of see the screen with their hands, and that became important to us. We tested 36 people, and they're regular users of tablets. About half of them were men, half of them were women, and we tested 2 very distinct groups. And we called the first group 18 to 28 digital natives, born into a world pretty much with digital devices. The second group we called print nets. And we jumped an age group, and I'll let you jump in here.
And with many things, we had lots of research questions at the beginning, things we were interested in, factors we'd like to compare, and we had to pick, because of our small data set, what questions do we think we could actually get at, and let's focus on those and not have everything involved. So for ages, we split into these 2 separate, because there's some marketing reasons of these two groups, and Mario was a lot of value describing these. And by splitting them into 2 separate groups, we tried to be able to get at an age effect instead of just having people that are just spread across all ages. If we had 500 participants or 1,000 participants or research that could come after this, tackling those ages and doing it more like a multivariate in between, it would be awesome, but we had to split it for our sample size.
And Mario Garcia, very well-known designer, started the design program at the Poyner Institute, did the first eye tracking studies in 1990, and has been involved as an advisor on all 5 pretty much of the studies. We did the testing at Poyner. They had about 90-minute sessions, and people came in, and we'll tell you a little bit about the environment in which they were tested. And maybe Jeremy, I'll have you
Sure,
talk about
absolutely.
the
I mean, part of what we focused on was, again, to limit the variables. We only looked at 10.5-inch iPads. So we didn't look at smaller devices. We didn't look at Kindle Fires. We didn't look at any of the Android tablets. It's not that we don't have interest in that. But again, we had a relatively small sample size, so we wanted to make sure that everyone was getting a similar experience, and especially at that time, it was a lot easier to say, do you have experience with a full-size iPad? It was the most common of the devices that were available. We prepped everyone so that they started in the same position. The tablet was placed on this sort of pillow that you saw behind me, and we, especially because we were interested in orientation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it was presented in a landscape orientation for everyone from the get-go.
And of course, they had the ability.
They could turn it,
to move it.
but we were giving it to them.
Kind of prime them to
prime them in landscape.
And we asked them to take a look at one of these 4 news sites first to get them comfortable with the system and Just, so in general, it was about 5 minutes. ESPN, the sports publication that is a vertical orientation, USA Today, NPR, and CNN. And we recorded them as they were reading. And then we gave them one of 3 prototype homepages. So every person received only one version to look at.
Right, of the homepage specifically. And these were prototypes that we created.
And these are, a big caveat here is, do we think that these are perfect homepage designs to use in reality? No. We had to like make specific decisions on them so we could see differences. And would we do, like as you go through and describe the different prototype
We're not suggesting
formats,
this is the next generation of news.
No,
it's
yeah.
not. This is what we could use to test that represented some key characteristics, which we're going to talk
Absolutely.
through.
So we based them on some common forms that were out there. One was a traditional that had a very clear hierarchy of image and headline, sort of inspired by the Boston Globe and the New York Times. One was a carousel, somewhat inspired by NPR and Pulse, in which people could swipe through the stories.
The traditional and the carousel feature literally the same stories, the same number of stories, which is worth noting.
There were 20 stories in total. And then the third version was a tile that very loosely was inspired by Flipboard. It was a little bit simpler than that, but there were basically 5 categories with one image each.
And all 5 of these stories are found in the other 2, but obviously there are stories on the other 2 that are not found on this homepage.
Yep.
So once the people came in, they were given one of these entryways. They worked in both landscape and portrait. We had an even number of people look at each one. But once they tapped on a story, they all looked at the same content inside. So the 3 differences had to do with the entryways.
Right. The article, the actual individual article designs were identical regardless of which of the 3 prototype home pages they received.
And the navigation inside, even though the home pages all featured same or subset of content and a different navigation patterns, once you got inside, literally everything is the same, even the way you navigate between stories.
Yep.
And that was on purpose so that we had to have a larger subset of things to test, or a larger set of things to test against on the article level.
Right. With our 2 kind of research questions from the beginning for reading patterns were, how do people choose what they want to read on a home screen? And then the second major question was, once they're reading something, how do they get to what the next thing?
Right. So navigational question.
So in terms of the stories and forms, our designs were rather simple. There's kind of a baseline approach. So we had text plus a still photograph, text plus a still graphic, text with a photo gallery, and the photo galleries obviously had thumbnails, as you would expect. Text with a video. Once you went into the video, it went to full frame. And then we had something that were pop-up graphics, and they were stories that if you tapped on different elements, content would pop up. We were looking at discovery and that type of thing. And these are examples of some of those pop-up graphics. Kobe Bryant versus Michael Jordan, and we compared different things. This is an LA Times graphic.
The yellow indicates a touch point, but the red that wouldn't have been visible to the user, but the red touch points actually were visible to the user, so it's fairly explicit.
So there were elements of surprise, and it was interesting to watch people as something would pop up and they'd go, oh, So the reaction was always kind of interesting. There were 20 total stories, and each of the news, business, sports, and life had one story that had a still photograph. Each of those categories had one story that was a still graphic, one with a photo gallery. Because if somebody read sports only, if that was their only interest, we wanted to make sure that they had the possibility of looking at a video.
Which doesn't mean necessarily that everyone encountered every story type. So it is quite possible that you could jump in between the 4 content categories, end up seeing mostly video or mostly pop-up graphics and not still photos. But it's less likely because they were evenly distributed.
Yeah, and based on the number of participants, it's impossible, and it would be ridiculous for us to even try to say the differences between somebody's reading experience that received they saw a gallery or somebody that received a video, because we might only have 5 or 6 people that we could compare across that. But a big a big point of ours on this project, which is different than some of the other research, is we wanted to set up a framework so that we could get people to get involved of what are the next questions. How can we have practitioners help? How can we have academics and students? And so we kind of wanted to build almost a research framework and not necessarily try to answer every question in this study.
And as those of you who have done the study know that there are thousands of touch points and eye movements, and so it's this huge aggregation of data when you use eye tracking gear, so that factors in as well. So each home page featured the same 20 stories in different ways, and this is a little bit about how people chose. More people expressed an interest in using the tablet in horizontal or landscape. That was something that we asked them even before they went into the study. It was about 70% for landscape. And we thought that was kind of interesting.
What we expected. I originally wanted to like not even code anything in portrait because it was just a lot more work for me. And I was, but we're like, no, we got to do portrait. And I was like, okay, at least let's get some data. And the major news apps actually didn't even have that data, which was kind of shocking. So
It wasn't easily collected, right?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of crazy. So so we just did a little pre-test and asked people. So at least we had some semblance. And later on, we got some data from one of the news apps that said, yeah, theirs was like, I think it was 75-25 was theirs, something like that.
A large percentage said that the traditional prototype, this one on the left, was most similar to what they regularly use. So after they were finished with the test, we laid them all out in front of them and said, of these three, which is most similar to what you use currently? And 83% said that the traditional was the most similar. But it was a higher percentage who said that they would choose the Carousel if they were going to choose between those three. And we thought that that was pretty significant. There's a good marriage of, good is relative, but a marriage of image and headline. And that was something that, was...
You got to be careful about saying significant in a crowd of academics. Interesting. It's interesting.
Totally scared of you guys. But we thought it was kind of interesting. Comments about people who liked this carousel or the tile design. They said it's tidier. I could kind of get through it to save time. But others said this makes me work too hard in the way you have it set up. It makes me do another click before I can even read anything. I definitely don't like the mystery meat of having to guess what's behind an image. So we did a lot of exit interviews, and it was interesting. As if you do usability studies, you see this. People who liked the traditional design said, I really like hierarchy. I'm big on written context. That's just me. I like a lot of description. And I loved this one. This guy said, I don't want to see a democratized judgment. In other words, he didn't want everything to be exactly the same. I like to see that some editor has made this judgment for me about what is important. People who liked the Carousel had interesting things to say, and they also drew the most intense reactions, both pro and con. So people who liked the Carousel said it's like a food buffet. You know what looks appetizing. So they were basically able to see all 20 stories at any,
presented almost equally. There was not, there wasn't even an implied editorial judgment in order, by order.
The Carousel gives me a quicker idea of what's there to read. I'm always drawn to photos first, and the Carousel seems to give me more choices than the other designs. Pictures say a lot. It helps me make a decision quickly. So there was a lot of positive reaction. And people who didn't like it said, this might be overwhelming. The Carousel is too busy. I don't know which to look at first. And this was one of my favorites. I don't like the Carousel. I end up looking at stupid stuff because I look at the photos instead of the headlines. I never want to read a story about the Broadway show Cats, but I'm drawn to the photo. So, there was a real visceral, sort of reaction from people. And in each of these, it struck me that if we were doing usability studies, we would do kind of iterative designs. If we looked at the Flipboard and chose that as our method, we would want to include more information and more headlines and things like that. So design needs to be iterative, but this is kind of what we saw. Mm-hmm. So we'll tell you a little bit about the behaviors, and I'll walk through, but you guys
Absolutely.
jump in.
You do it.
Well, so, that people enter through a dominant element is and has been a theme through Poyner eye tracking over the years. There's nothing, not to say it's not surprising, but that it turns out that a tablet environment is very similar to the other environments, at least according to what we saw, in that people are entering through a dominant image. They're certainly attracted to faces. It really fits these core elements. And then especially in the carousel, you saw the entering through faces when all images were equal in size, then the size of the dominant element within the image and the size of how dominant that was relative to other images on the page were very, that was a clear indicator of where people's attention went. It's something that we already know. It's not really surprising, even though, say, the baseball player image and the motorcycle image are actually even sized. The face drew the attention of the users.
In this case, things that were cropped a little more tightly, the football, people often looked at that because it just seemed to have a little more throw weight to it. Not just because it's a football, but, and then people were drawn to faces first. And this is true when you look at print or anything else, but we just thought it was interesting among these three designs.
So yeah, so this was interesting.
This was in some ways fantastic.
So the amount of things that people fixated upon before choosing what to read was 18 times on average. I think you've got a sequence with little X's on stuff. So what this would be is somebody looks at text, a photo, a caption, whatever it might be, and they kind of bounce around and look at different things. And as it goes,
more than once.
yeah, and actually what ends up happening is that it's more kind of like widely spread to many things, and then it narrows down, and then you start to go back and forth, especially on these screens where there's a lot of fixation points, or the carousel. You would wind down and then decide between two things and then go into one of them.
And this is similar too to our print studies, to web studies. People look at a lot of things. It's just a very common commonality. And people who didn't finish reading the first story, they looked at fewer things.
Right, and this echoes something from Eyetrack 07, that the more options that the person had before they chose what they wanted to read was they were more likely to finish the story. So we're kind of making up a little bit of an assumption there that it's this kind of grass is greener. I looked at more things, so I know what's available. I'm more likely to finish because I'm not, let me not go back to the front and start over because I already know what's available.
And we're not necessarily talking about total quantity of things looking at. We're not saying that on a home screen that had 20 things versus 5, that makes you more likely to read to completion on the thing that had 20, but rather that of the total available choices, the more the user looked at, the more likely they were to finish. So if there were 5 choices and they looked at 3 of them as opposed to looking at all 5 of them, they were less likely to finish.
Interesting point that I don't remember what the number is. I could have to dig it up. But off of the Flipboard, of where there was only 5 things, the other 2 had 20. Flipboard only had 5. But I still think that the average fixation points was like almost 14.
Yeah, it was 13 or 14.
High.
It was. I think. It was
So people
something
were
like
going
that.
back and forth between choices.
Narrowing down.
The more winnowing you did, the more likely you are to read to conclusion, which is an
It's like
interesting.
test driving a car or dating a lot before you get married.
Yeah, speed dating. Yeah. Speed dating. That's a good one for it, right?
So this was interesting. An overall average of 1.5 minutes was spent on stories, the first story that somebody selected to read. But of the people, again, who didn't finish reading that first story, they spent only 78.3 seconds on average before they just said, and bailed out. And so we were calling this the bailout point. So out of the people that we looked at in, the minutia and the detail that we looked at of what they were looking at, this stood out as something kind of interesting. How much do people read before they say, I don't know if I want this or not? So about 78 seconds. And we think that this is a consideration that we've had. This might be a good benchmark to consider establishing a gold coin to keep a reader engaged about halfway through a long story.
No, we did not test the gold coin. We didn't really we didn't have a good way of assessing what their motivation in leaving was. Was it that they were disinterested or that they felt like they knew what was in the content of the story? But we did notice that there was this point that they stopped reading. And so we're interested in, could we, through further testing or further study, better understand what we could do to either keep them engaged in the material or at least understand why they wanted to leave.
Yeah, so like a couple possible research questions being, if we could increase motivation before they started, would that bailout point shift to be higher? Would they stay longer with it? Or if we gave them something in the middle of the story, a la, I mean, it's come back up a couple times today, but of a snowfall, giving them some narrative component throughout the story, could we in mid-story increase their motivation and push them past that average bailout point?
What was the percentage of people who bailed out?
Well,
No,
no,
that was
78
the-
was the number of seconds
Seconds.
of reading time.
I have a hard time saying, I don't want to tell you a number because we only have like 36 people, so it's hard to say, well, 30%. Because it wasn't so spread that I would feel comfortable going out on a limb and giving you a percentage that sounds representative when it's not.
We've been trying to think about what that might be. It's not just as though anything that you throw in there would make sense, but it could be that it's a simple pull-out quote from somebody who's not yet been, hasn't appeared in the story.
And we did, all of the stories that we used was content that was published already. And we didn't necessarily look at how was the story structured. So we weren't saying we're going to take only inverted pyramid stories or only long-form narrative style stories. So that also could be a consideration because we're generalizing across all of the different kinds of stories, and some of the stories were different in their story structure. So it's not that you can infer something just from that either, but I think that also is worth study. So if we have an inverted pyramid style story and we have a sort of long-form narrative story, would there be a different bailout point? We don't know, but it would be interesting to find out.
Do you remember what the percentage of people that read the story to completion from Eyetrack 07 was?
Not offhand, sorry, my brain.
It's definitely, let's say, it's closer to 50-50 than 0-100.
Yeah.
So I can dig that up.
So, in terms of what that is, we're interested in experimenting with that and doing a little more testing. But, it could be something that projects something that's yet to come in the story. It could be an informative visual element that asks a question or keeps the reader interested. Or it could be because you want the person to come back to your publication and feel satisfied. Maybe, it's interesting to say a quick summary of what they've already read to that point. So, if they leave there saying, yep, that verifies what I've read, we'd like to see if that improves their satisfaction.
And this was a closed environment. So you didn't have the option to leave this site or app and go somewhere else, which is also an interesting point. So this may also potentially be an interesting point at which to say, here is other related content or unrelated content from our site, from our app that you might want to see, but we also didn't test that. I mean, that could be something that we could explore because you shouldn't necessarily equate it with saying, okay, well, this is an exit point for the site or app because we didn't allow that. But it'd be worth testing whether we could drive people to other places and decrease something like a bounce rate, say, in a future experiment.
Yeah, or if we know, all sorts of interesting research questions. If we know that most people are going to leave at that point anyway because they've gotten, the 80-20, they've gotten 80% of what they need, they don't really care about finishing the rest. Could we do something like you were saying, Sarah, about a summary to make them feel more satisfied so that we can increase brand loyalty or likelihood of returning, something like that? So there's a lot of really interesting research questions we could push on this bailout.
On the bailout point. And we didn't test comprehension either. So, that's yet another area of potential research, which is to say, does the amount of reading you get before you bail out actually lead you to understand the material? Because as a journalist, that's a pretty important question for me, is whether you've got to understanding before you abandoned. And, we didn't know, we weren't asking questions at that point because it was a more fluid testing environment. If you wanted to read something else, you did.
Yeah.
Now, people read about 250 words a minute on average. There's a variation. So you can start to say about what, length of copy that is. And that 78 seconds sort of keys to other studies that talk about that length with video. So if you haven't really hooked somebody at 78 seconds in video, that's roughly the point at which they're going to bail. A minute 10 seconds, minute 20 seconds. And we know if you have people jump a lot, there's a certain volume that they read. So we like to look back to our other studies and see some of the parallels.
This was an interesting one.
Not what we
expected.
The 67% of the people used the native controls to get to the second story. So they were reading and they went back to the homepage versus going from here's other stuff you might want to read, or using our home button. And Sarah, we got into all sorts of conversations about this, and many times she's like, "Can you hide the Chrome? Can you hide that address bar? It's messing with my design. Hide that for me." And I was like, "Come on, Sarah, it's hard." And it's really like a pain in the butt to do it if you're doing web and not like a native app. And so I made her, I'm like, "No, we got to keep it in because we're testing the web. We're testing the web."
Then a couple days later, I'd call him back and say,
"Are you sure?"
"I was just wondering if we could hide the Chrome."
But it was interesting in the end that the majority of people used that as the back. And so, the people like to default to UI, Jeremy talks about this a lot, about affordances.
An affordance they know, not an affordance that we created. Now, could we have designed our affordances differently? Sure. But even so, with a pretty obvious affordance that they had to skip over to get to the back button, they very routinely
like
did.
like a home icon. That's pretty obvious what it does, but they use that back button all day, every day in every other app. So there's zero risk they're going to have a usability error.
Yeah.
But isn't that like driving on the right side of the road?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Why change? Why change a good
We
thing?
have habits.
Exactly.
So we could have designed these other elements, nav elements, in 1,000 different ways, but it was really overwhelming that they were going to that. Now, that doesn't mean that everything should include Chrome, but it means that
When
those
Chrome's
devices
present.
people are pretty familiar with. So you don't want to necessarily, design something that looks like something else. If they have to stop and think about it, chances are they're not going to look at it.
Sure.
Magazines quite often on tablets are set up for readers to swipe horizontally from one story to another. And so one of the things that we're interested in is what are some of the standards? But you might, be reading about traffic in the city, you're going to swipe to another story, and it's a completely different topic.
And we wanted to know how instinctual are some of these behaviors so that this sort of swiping vertically to get more information in an individual story, to see more of the content, to read more deeply. Is this an instinctual, natural behavior, or is this a behavior that we've learned that systems, publishing systems like Adobe have taught us that this is the way that one should read?
And, if you're going to read more of the same topic, because we have scroll bars on our computers, we're used to going vertically for more of the same content. So we sat in one of our meetings and we said, well, we all know that, people go horizontally
Photo
through
galleries go
photos.
side to side.
And then we kind of got
Left, right,
quiet
left,
and said,
Why?
do we really know that, or do we
Why
just
are those
think that?
paradigms so different?
So we did another part of this study, and we tested 130 some people, 120 people, to see if there was an instinctive swipe pattern, and it was randomized. We did it across a couple of different cities, and we found this overwhelming instinct for people to go horizontally through photographs. Some of the stuff is so minute, but it's like we could make assumptions all day long, but we really wanted to see if that was the case.
And they would swipe horizontally even though the arrows were there?
Oh, there
No,
were arrows.
that white arrow is
Yeah.
not there.
Oh,
Th-
no,
those-
I mean that the
And even the
arrows
tiny
on the
arrows.
side.
So in our study, we had no visual cue
Okay.
when we tested the 130.
Yeah, so we had full screen images, and you were
This
presented.
is not exact. This is
Yes,
not.
this isn't the
This is
prototype.
actually not what you got. That we made this thing that was just full screen images, like you opened up the Photos app. Is essentially what it was.
And you were presented with the device in a particular orientation by the tester, and there were a whole variety of testers. So it was either portrait or landscape. And then the photos, you weren't given any kind of cue as to what way to swipe the photos. The only verbal cue was that you were supposed to look at all the photos. And so some of the people received the device in a portrait mode and would swipe horizontally, and some of the people received the device in a portrait mode and swipe vertically. And then you would randomly again, the device would be taken back and be given back to you, again, either in portrait or landscape as for the research cue. And you wouldn't necessarily know what way to swipe. And so we were measuring against sort of your instinctual behavior unprimed, and then a primed behavior, meaning that you had seen it one way, but it wasn't necessarily going to be presented to you that way again. And when we prompted the people about how to use it, we weren't discussing navigation. We were discussing the content of the images. So we had some, I don't want to say throwaway, but questions about the content of the images so that hopefully they wouldn't realize it was necessarily a
get at what we
navigation
were asking.
experiment.
Yeah, and if anybody, faculty, grad student, or whatever wants to help out with this, that what we'd like to
Still
do
going, yeah.
is do 3 sets of it, and basically do it with this random order and see if by the time they get to the end, if they get enough wrongs, like I tried to go horizontally, but oh, that's vertical, then the next one, by the time we get to the third, can we untrain them from the instinct? Because in the first test, p-value 0.001, everybody went horizontal. Everybody goes horizontal. And then the numbers are leaning toward if they got, if that was wrong, like if I get it in vertical, it's easier to retrain that horizontal is not the way to go.
So surprised, people learn that pretty quickly.
And so think, well, maybe it's because of the shape of the device and, the longer direction is sending you that way. So don't exactly know why. And then we don't have enough data points to actually get statistical significance, but it's leaning that way. So if we get about 135 more people, we can get another fun p-value. So if anybody wants to help.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, we're gonna do it, but it's if you have an iPad, one second, if you have an iPad and you have students and each student does a couple, that's fine. We've got all the research protocol for that.
You ran 80 students, something like that?
We had a lot of students.
I did 50. And Dave and Jeremy set up this protocol. It's very easy to follow.
It's very
Even
easy.
for
Even
someone like
if you haven't done usability, if you want to introduce students to usability testing, this is a very nice, easy way to do it, and it would help us.
You had students in a class,
I
in
had
a
students in
seminar.
2 classes.
That's what they use to learn as a usability
Test
test.
analysis.
Yeah.
And it's still online. It's still available. We've got the protocol.
Yep, we're
So
gonna
if you're
keep adding
interested,
to it.
come up and find us later.
Yeah. Question?
What kind of baseline measures did you take on prior experiences with the iPad?
Good question.
Because
We asked whether you had used, but we didn't ask about use of photo galleries specifically.
For this little swipe direction thing, which was almost like a pretest, that we didn't assume anything. Just whomever finds somebody.
We brought the iPad. It wasn't your iPad.
Yeah.
The reason I'm asking that, I think it would strike me that if you had an iPhone or an iPod, that's how you experience the use of photos. People turn it horizontally and say, hey, check these out.
Sure.
So you
Yeah, and it works on the web that way. On the web, all photo
Selfies.
galleries go side. So it's one of those, we could tease it out, but then we'd need 500 data points to do that. So it's like, we'll just let that one go and not worry about experience. We did on the Eyetrack tablets part, the bigger study, we specifically made sure that people had either owned or had access to an iPad for 6 months. So for our 36 people that we did the longer testing on, those were all people who understood how an iPad worked so that they weren't fumbling with the controls. Because since you have to code every single thing they do, we didn't want a bunch of noise in the fixations because it's a pain. So again, trying to make it easier for us.
And the swipe test was just observed. We did not use eye tracking gear, so you literally handed the tablet to them, saw what they did, and it was only the first gesture that mattered anyway. So it's again simple to read. Was there another question?
For each subject, there were between 150 and 500 specific data points.
On the Eyetrack
Eye
users.
movements and taps and swipes and touches. And
there's a lot of stuff.
So people swiped horizontally regardless of orientation. In the eye tracking part, we saw that people used, very few of them used the thumbnails to navigate. And this makes sense too. The majority used the advanced buttons. It has to do with the availability, the position that people are holding something in. They don't necessarily want to move their hand back and forth. So it's,
I can't remember. Do we measure the number of people who picked up the tablet off of the wedge, the cushion that we set it on? I can't remember.
It wasn't a high
Not many.
percentage.
No, it was a low percentage.
Yeah.
So as opposed to, no one in the room is actually using it. Well, there's one, but almost someone's using a tablet. But you see a lot of people holding a tablet like this. Our users did have the tablet in front of them, so potentially they had both hands free, but they still were keeping their hands in the kind of position that you would have basically assumed. So their thumbs were near as if they were holding.
People picked it up if they wanted to, change the orientation. Okay, so this is how people read. About half of the people read methodically, and I'll give you a definition of methodically, and about half read in a scanning manner. And this followed our other recent Eyetrack studies in terms of these definitions. Methodical readers tended to read in sequence, top to bottom. They tended to read story lists very methodically from top to bottom, looking at every single item. They might have looked away to another element and then gone back to the same area in text that they were reading, and they tended to be caption readers. And scanning readers tended to look at headlines, lists, and display elements first, without a lot of text reading. They would read a part of the story, jump around and not necessarily go back. And this really related very heavily to how they chose a story. So some people were very methodical. They were examining everything before they even tapped. And other people were scanning. But this was interesting.
Yeah, so it's 50-50, and then once you control for age, and this is probably not all that surprising, that it splits out really cleanly, that the print nets were much more methodical, reading straight down the lists and very, very deliberate, and that the digital natives were scanners and kind of all over the place.
Factoring in margin of error, I mean, they're basically the same. Inverse of each other.
This was significant.
Right.
And it was because how many of you have said or heard people say young people don't read?
Well, and that's an important thing that I do think we need to make clear is when we look at those two definitions, the implication is not that scanners are not readers.
She has a slide for that. Wait for it.
Wait for my reveal.
Wait for it.
So how many times have we heard that?
Yeah, they read deeply.
But we found that once people selected a story, both of the groups read deeply once they found what they wanted.
And actually, the actual number, not significant, but that the digital natives actually read longer than the print nets. Their average time spent with the story was higher. So
Their focus was different.
How they got there was different, but once that they were there, they read longer than the print nets.
So this really goes counter to the assumption that young people don't read. It's just the manner in which people choose is different on age.
Not
significant, but it's very, very, it's pointing that direction. So we need more data.
And remember that the reading experience is the same for both of them. So it's not like the print nets got to pick traditional and then the younger people went somewhere else. They both had the same reading experience either way. So we were comparing like things.
So then we took a look, because this is a touch environment, and we found that a large percentage of people tapped the screen, touched the screen very frequently. Some were more hands-off, and a detached reader, as we call them, touched the screen pretty infrequently. They might arrange the text and then sit back to read. That was a smaller percentage. Intimate readers kept almost constant touch with the screen, and they tended to read 1 or 2 lines of text, keeping their eyes in the same place, and then they would replenish the text in that area. It's kind of interesting. And that seemed a little bit like a teleprompter to me. It's not as though, a president has the entire speech up there, he needs to focus. So those people who were intimate readers were like replenishing the space, or a little bit like the old analog device for those of us who were typesetters or you have to draw focus. And we thought that was pretty interesting. So somebody who was in constant contact with the screen really was trying to draw focus. And Mario Garcia says you have to keep the fingers happy. So it goes to trying to make a touch environment, the possibilities, make use of that in the storytelling, because people like to touch. They like this.
And I never knew it, but this is me. I'm one of these intimate readers, and even if it's all just text, it's like lots of little finger movements, like eyeballs staying in the same place and kind of moving the visual, keeping your eyes in one place and moving the visual field, versus visual field stays static and you move your eyes.
Yeah.
When you did the 07 study, did you see anything with intimate readers there?
Well, we couldn't, because it's like when you're using a mouse, we didn't have the same thing.
The reason I ask is I actually have brought something in my head. I have a student who I was helping, and the student was reading by highlighting with the mouse the things that they were reading.
There's a couple people did that in Eyetrack 07, and there was about 500 people, but I think maybe a handful did like click selecting to keep their place on the web, if I'm just recalling from 07.
But just think about the other design difference where you have a rollover, where you're rolling over something, getting more information. You don't have that in a touch environment. So touch becomes really crucial.
There's no hover.
No hover state.
That's a good point.
And go back up too, because there was the rates. One more.
Oh yeah.
The rate. To me, I found this really interesting from behavioral research. You can actually see the rates, how many times they would touch per minute, and so we were trying to find out what are the touch rates. And so these two kind of factors that we have of intimate, detached, methodical, and scanners, we're all very intrigued about creating some little quadrants and how these two factors work in. And if we could create kind of real-time behavioral analytics and measuring what people are looking at and how they're interacting, their touch events, if we could start to like customize parts of the interface for intimate scanners, detached methodical, that sort of thing. And it wasn't clean where like, it's not like all the methodical people were detached. Like me personally, I'm a methodical intimate. I go in very sequence and then I do all these
I
little-
heard that about you.
Yeah. Methodically intimate.
And we couldn't map detached and intimate by age.
No, we couldn't.
It doesn't, it's so close to sort of evenly distributed. It wasn't at all like scanning and methodical.
Like that one just was like,
Very
but
obvious.
this one did not split
wasn't.
out.
And it's
Small
so-
sample size, but
It's so
we couldn't.
different to watch this, when
We have a
we're
video of this, right?
keeping track of all the video. I do.
I thought,
Is it in the
I thought
deck?
we did. I
Is it
thought
in
it
the
was
deck?
Oh,
excuse me.
it's out of the deck. See, the thing that I thought was out of the deck is in the deck.
But it was rather easy to watch somebody read if they weren't touching the screen, but people who were constantly touching, we made, note of every single element that they looked at, that they tapped. So here's why we thought these particular elements of our study were kind of worthwhile. We found that tablet users have a high number of fixations before making a selection, and that is true across media. They often fixate on the same story multiple times before choosing it. And the more fixations suggest that they're more likely to read to completion. And in terms of design, and I'll tell you, because I'm sitting at Poyner where we're constantly talking to industry people who are just like, just tell us what to do with all of this stuff. They're looking for actionable steps. The clarity with which a decision can be made, the clarity of headline, the marriage of an image and headline, the chance that you might have hierarchy, all of these things make a difference to give people a satisfactory choice. And so, you want to say anything else about that?
I don't think so. That's good.
We found this, what we thought, fairly critical bailout point, and we think it's interesting to consider what you might put at this bailout point to compel readers to continue. We've got a webinar coming up, and we're really looking at specific story forms, lots of examples.
What are some examples of people who seem to be doing this either instinctually or based on their own research that they haven't shared?
And what those things could be, because the worst thing that could happen is somebody would say, oh, that study said throw something in there at 78.3 seconds, just anything.
Yeah, anything.
We know
We don't
that's
think that. I mean,
failure.
And if anybody's doing maybe like a early master's research seminar and you have graduate students that you're trying to introduce to experimental methodologies, please talk to us and we could set you up, and because it's super easy to do, it takes like 5 minutes, so it might help us help you.
And then, the fact that younger readers are more likely to be scanners, older readers find stories methodically, but both read very deeply once they choose.
and so you could, based on that, you really could start to think, if you have done audience research and you know that your campus publication, your professional publication, or your targeted audience is older or younger, then you have the possibility of setting something up that would be more satisfying to a scanner, more satisfying to a methodical reader, and we think that there's some value there. And there are lots of industry things you can think about, like the Neiman experience, where you sort of hide the rest of the Neiman Lab experience, you hide the rest of the navigation when you're looking at the story. That kind of thing may well appeal to a methodical reader in a way it might not appeal to a scanner reader. We obviously didn't test it, but you could start to think about some of those kinds of questions.
Now, we have plans to go back in and do a little more testing, and we'd like to share those with you, get your feedback, but wondered if there are any questions.